We're on the air again with another edition of Pachios on the News, and we have what I think is a particularly interesting program tonight. Two people from, all of you would recognize the Portland Press Herald, but we have to refer to it, I want to refer to it technically as the organization that owns most of the daily newspapers in Maine and probably most of the weeklies, and it's called the
Maine Trust for Local News.
Maine Trust for Local News, a nonprofit. This occurred about a year ago, this purchase by the nonprofit. The nonprofit owns some newspapers in other parts of the country. It's a new organization, and it's in the process of acquiring other newspapers. Newspapers are essential to not only democracy, but to our communities. And often we take them for granted, but think of it. If there was no newspaper to report on what's going on at City Hall, a lot will happen. Because I've been around a lot of politicians in my day who wished there were no newspapers. So it was a fervent wish of some. So it's essential to our democracy, essential to our community, and it's tough business these days. A lot of competition for people's attention, and not much advertising, at least as much as there used to be. So they're hard to keep going, and the people who run them have to be very, very creative. Tonight, as guests, we have two guests. Stefanie Manning, who is sitting across from me. She is the managing director of these newspapers. The newspapers include the daily newspapers in Portland, Augusta, Waterville, and Lewiston. That's 4 of the 5 daily newspapers in the state of Maine, and many weekly or even 2-day-a-week newspapers. I think Bath Brunswick Times is now a couple of days a week.
That's right.
So that's what's happening in journalism, and we have to keep it afloat and vibrant and successful. And I'm talking to the two people whose job it is to keep it interesting, vibrant, and successful. Across from me is Stefanie Manning. She is the managing director of the Trust for Local News in Maine, so overall all of the newspapers, yes, including the weeklies?
Including the weeklies.
And to her left, to my right, is Carolyn Fox, who is the executive editor of these newspapers. So they're the two key people, and we want to talk about the future of local journalism in Maine. What's it going to be like? What are the problems going to be? And what are these folks thinking about in terms of making it successful and continuing to make it relevant to you? So Stefanie, I want to start by introducing you a little bit and talking a little bit about you, and we'll do the same with Carolyn. Stefanie, you're from New York, but by marriage, you're from Portland, Maine, right?
I am a Mainer by marriage, very proudly, one of the best decisions I've ever made. We've been back in Maine for almost 12 years. I joined the then newspaper company, Maine Today Media, 12 years ago as the vice president of marketing. Soon after that, I took on circulation responsibility. And then soon after that, we purchased our local owner purchased 2 other newspaper companies, and all of a sudden we were sitting on top of 3 newspaper companies, 1 management team, trying to figure out the sustainable path forward for newspapers in Maine.
And for those of you watching this show who are either Irish or follow sports, the name Manning would be familiar to you because over the years, particularly at Cheverus High School, there have been many Mannings who sports lovers like myself paid attention to. In fact, I remember as a kid, I believe it was in the late 40s, there was a great basketball player at Chevrolet named Eddie Manning, and he's probably related to your
It's my
husband.
father-in-law.
He's your father-in-law. How about that? But he was a great player at Chevrolet. Stefanie's husband, Tom Manning, played at Chevrolet. And so a lot of Mannings, when anybody who grew up in an Irish neighborhood in Portland knows who the Mannings are. And Stefanie's one of them now.
Lucky me.
And to my right, Carolyn Fox, who is the executive editor of all of these newspapers. And so she's responsible for the news that you read. And she runs the show. All of the other editors report to her. And Carolyn came here from Tampa, where she was the editor of the Tampa paper.
I was the managing editor of the Tampa Bay Times, yes.
Managing editor of the Tampa Bay Times, which is a much bigger operation than this one.
In some ways, the paper itself was bigger, but if you combine all our staff across all the different papers here, it's not bigger.
Yeah, because now you have several newspapers.
Exactly.
And that's the difference. And is it Tampa Bay Times? Is that the name?
Yes, it was formerly the St. Petersburg Times, and then 10 years or so they changed the name to represent all of Tampa Bay.
And that's owned by a nonprofit, isn't it?
It is. It's owned by the Poynter Institute, which other journalists who are watching may be familiar with, but a little bit different ownership structure. They're way less involved than the National Trust is with the Maine Trust.
They just provide the money and...
Well, I think they make sure that operation can be sustainable on its own.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm not sure Poynter's putting money forward as much as just making sure they support as they can.
Right.
Yeah.
So the nonprofit that owns these newspapers here in Maine, the newspapers that you folks run, they own other newspapers?
They do. So we're owned by the nonprofit, the National Trust for Local News. They are a 5-year-old nonprofit. They started out with a state-level subsidiary in Colorado and have since acquired another state-level subsidiary in Georgia. And then the Maine Trust for Local News was the third state-level subsidiary. They do have a vision plan to be much more widely distributed, but given some of the pressures of our business over the last year and a half, they've slowed down their acquisition strategies so that they can focus on these 3 very different newspaper models. Each state is very different in its makeup, so that they can kind of use us as experiments to figure out what is the right model for local newspapers when you have only weeklies or digital only or dailies and weeklies where we sit.
So you're very important to the model that they're trying to create, right?
We are. The National Trust across the state level subsidiaries has something like 500 employees, and we're close to 400 of them.
Really?
So we're a really big slice of the pie. I think what made the Maine newspapers attractive to the National Trust was that up until a year and a half ago, we were running a profitable business by the skin of our teeth, but profitable nonetheless. And part of our model, it include making sure that our local owner got out of the business what he needed to. And so, for us, part of the attractiveness of being owned by a non-for-profit is that we're able to manage the business, hopefully, eventually back to profitable, and have that money stay in Maine. So we're able to reinvest it back into the business. We're at a pressure point right now. I mean, it's no surprise that the news business is changing rapidly on a day-to-day basis, and as you mentioned, the business is hard. The traditional streams of revenue that come into our business, print advertising, print circulation, have been on the decline for the 12 years that I've been at this organization. And so at some point, those declines, become unmanageable. So it's a really interesting business model. Since 2019, we've been accelerating our digital revenues. They're not yet making up for the declines in print, but are much stronger.
They're growing.
They're growing and at a much faster pace than they had previously.
Which means, I assume, that there are an awful lot of people out there, particularly young people, who are coming into adulthood, who read the newspaper online.
Well, I also think it's adults that are, getting their digital bearings and they're waking up in the morning and their iPhone is next to them and they're pulling that out and hopefully getting our daily headlines, and it's taking them to an e-paper, which is the same way to read the newspaper as if you're sitting there, turning the print pages. And so I think it's a combination of people's consumption habits changing, where they're looking for their news, those places that they're going to is changing, and you know what they say about habits. If you do that long enough, the old ones kind of fall to the wayside. So
the National Trust raises money. That's how they acquired your newspapers. They raise, and you raise money with. They raise it nationally.
That's right.
You raise money locally.
That's right.
So there are people who, all of you, can contribute to making your local news option even better by contributing to these folks. And those resources, those extra resources, are what helps Carolyn make it a better paper.
That's right.
And something that folks who are watching are interested in reading. Everybody likes to complain about their local newspaper.
you have no idea.
It is a favorite. It is a favorite thing to complain about the paper.
Yes.
I don't read that
We
paper.
love
There's
it.
no news in it. There's this. There's that. Everybody has a different opinion, and everybody's interested in something different. But there's certain constants in the news business. One constant is sports, and another constant is obituaries. People always, I mean, you look at the New York Times, they focus on obituaries. I mean, obituaries are very important. So are there some things that people don't complain about? I mean, that they really like?
That's a great question. I think that there are subject matters that people want to see us write about, that it's very clear, excuse me, in the analytics that resonate, I think, with both digital and print readers. Some of it is sports, and in Maine, particularly high school sports. I think some of it is food, honestly, is a huge topic that we don't get a lot of complaints about. I think people would just love to see us write more about it. There's obviously the push and pull of housing and new versus old and development that's going on right now. And I think people have opinions about that, but the more we write about it, the happier they are. They want to see those stories. Another is climate change and environment and how that's impacting Maine. Those stories really resonate with our readers, not only here in Portland, but around the state. So I think it's less about sections maybe and more about subject matter that resonate with people that they would like us to do more and more of. And that comes with tough choices about what we don't do anymore. And that's when people get upset.
So how do you get feedback? I guess people are not reluctant to tell the newspaper?
No,
complaints?
I do think that, like in everything, sometimes the loudest voices say the same things over and over again. And I think what's important is to also look beyond those voices sometimes when you're making hard decisions about what you're covering and not covering based on the resources you have. So one of the things we can look at is what people are reading on our website and what people are reading in our e-newspaper, what people are responding to in those places or on social media, and make decisions based on sort of how wide of an audience something is getting.
I hear people, friends of mine who are conservative, they say, "Oh, that's a liberal newspaper," and so is that you have a editorial? You make an editorial decision. We're going to be liberal.
No, maybe some newspapers do. These ones certainly don't. I think that one thing that people don't realize is how separate our opinion section is from the rest of the newspaper. And oftentimes the viewpoints of our opinion section get lumped in with the rest of our reporting. I do think that because we have a readership that is fairly left-leaning, a lot of our letters to the editor end up being left-leaning, and that's something we're working on and something I actively want our opinion team to be more thoughtful about, because I do think it makes it look like we have a leaning one way, when in reality I would love to see more conservative or conservative-leaning folks write us and contribute, either as letters to the editor or op-eds. So that's something I want to actively work on, is making our opinion section more representative of our state. And I think that's a hard task when you need to bring in people that have sort of left us behind because of this idea that we're a liberal newspaper. So that's something I definitely want to make a goal for 2025, and hope that helps some of the chatter about being a liberal newspaper. I think in terms of our reporters and their reporting, I think they try very hard to be fair and balanced, and I think for the most part they succeed. But if people feel differently, I'm always happy to hear about it.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, you're a nonprofit. You're not capitalist with a point of view. And I know I grew up here. I worked for the Portland Press Herald as a reporter at one time. I was a paper boy for many years.
Thank you.
Delivering the Portland Press Herald and the Portland Evening Express. So I've had a long connection with it. Through most of my life, it was owned by the Gannett family. Guy Gannett was a neighbor of mine and a devout Republican, and they always endorsed Republicans. I mean, it was expected that they, because he wanted to endorse Republicans. He owned the newspaper. He wanted to endorse Republicans. That was it, and it was okay with the rest of us. His wife, Guy Gannett's wife, was for 25 years a member of the Republican National Committee in Washington. So these people were involved in politics, and they always endorsed Republicans. But that didn't affect what was on the front page of the newspaper. I mean, news is news, and people don't sit around and say, I'm going to give it a slant, unless you're at Fox News or MSNBC or something. Then you make a conscious decision. But that wasn't the case with the Portland newspapers, and it isn't the case now. So you're right. People read those letters to the editors. A lot of them are lean to the left, and they say, "Oh, this is a liberal newspaper." So it's an issue that is hard to control, but you got to figure out some way to do it.
You know, I feel like as media has diversified so greatly, right? Everything from TV and radio that capture audiences, and especially social media. Newspapers just aren't seen as the place to get your news, because news is everywhere. And so I feel like that has been a cultural shift, where people just don't think of the newspaper as the place to get their news. And the reality of our business since the Guy Gannett days is that we've been the ones out reporting on the things going on around Maine. And yes, the TV stations do that, but a lot of the times the TV stations are reporting on our stories. And that hasn't changed. A lot of the local news comes out of the work that our newsrooms around this state are, and the resources that we're putting into making sure that these stories are being told. I think it's just a really interesting way to think about the media business, because without newspapers, most of the headlines that people are reading, no matter where you read them, in Maine, we wouldn't have those stories.
Television news is reactionary. Things happen and they report on what's happening. Automobile accident, murder, whatever. But a newspaper is actually looking for stories. Television stations are not sitting around in editorial boards and rooms thinking, where's the story? Only the newspapers do that. And if the newspapers, local newspapers disappear, there's going to be a real change.
That's right.
No question about it. Television is more entertainment. No question about it. So you do have, you pointed out that you have declining revenues for advertising, declining revenues for subscriptions. But you have another business there. You have a printing press.
We sure do.
Is that a business where you can make money printing?
It is, and since so the National Trust acquired us 18 months ago. One of our kind of strategic initiatives, our transformation strategies, was to double down on commercial printing, and so we've made space for that in our facility and in our schedules, and we have we have more pressmen today than we had a couple of years ago. And so we're printing all of our own products, which are a lot. But we also, our biggest commercial print customer is the Bangor Daily News. So their success is our success. It's really important to us that they continue to be vital in the state. We also are the beneficiaries of other printing facilities across New England closing.
Really?
So there was a plant in New Hampshire that recently closed, and we picked up a good amount of work from that facility. It's been reported that the Providence Journal is going all digital, and they're closing their print shop down in Rhode Island, and we're actively looking at jobs that can come up to Maine, print jobs that can come up to Maine as a result of that closure.
So this really is a separate business, a printing business.
It has the potential to be. Our print work takes up a lot of bandwidth.
Yeah.
And so, thinking about the sustainability of our products and what we can take on relative to other print work is part of the mix of the work that we're doing.
So, columnists. I remember when Bill Nimitz was writing, I would run into people who, they always read it, Bill Nimitz. I mean, even the people who got mad at him.
We love Bill.
There was a lot of people mad at him, but they would never, they would always read it. And so, are columnists important? Because I don't think you have any now.
We do.
You do?
We do. We have a sports columnist that we shifted over in October when I got here, and we have a culture columnist, Leslie Bridgers, who started last week as a columnist. She's our former features editor. And we're hoping to turn one other staffer to a news columnist in the next month or so. Because I believe columnists are important, and I think we've shifted a lot of our resources to freelancers who were serving as columnists, and we're shifting some of that back in-house, because I think, to your point about Bill, I think in-house columnists can really drive readership. They can drive sourcing. They can drive story ideas that someone who's not in the office, not interacting with our journalists every day, just doesn't. So we are making a specific shift to getting columnists back in our newsroom.
And can you, I don't know, you have labor agreements too, so does that permit you to hire on a part-time basis somebody to just get paid for writing one weekly column a week, or doesn't work for you full-time? Are you able to do that?
We do pay people weekly to write columns for us. We're getting away from some of that and shifting that to our staff, who will write more like 2 or 3 columns a week. And this is staffers who, have the skill set and have sought out these positions. I'm not forcing people to be columnists that don't want to be. I think good columnists should want to be a columnist. It comes with a lot of baggage, right? You're a public face. You're going to get the same amount of hate meal as I do.
Yeah.
But I think having internal columnists is a real boon for us on a lot of fronts, including that if you establish that regular rhythm and you get a readership, it's a way to keep subscribers on board that might not stay otherwise.
So what is the future? We talked a little bit about digital. You said that, I thought this was interesting, you said the Providence Journal is going all digital. So
One of
what's
a few places that's going
Yeah.
all digital.
one of the few
Yeah, it's a pretty big movement right now.
to go digital.
Yeah.
So as you look ahead, 10 or 15 years, is it possible that we'll have 5 big national print newspapers and all local journalism will be digital? Is that a possibility?
Anything is a possibility, Harold. I would say if we knew the answer to that question, we wouldn't be in this predicament that we're in. We're in a predicament here in Maine relative to the newspapers. Our revenues are declining, our expenses are going up. It costs a lot of money to deliver newspapers in rural Maine, especially as circulation goes down. I mean, I can tell you that famous Tom Manning and I, once upon a time, were out delivering newspapers when we were going through a carrier shortage. That is the hardest job in Maine. In the middle of the night, no matter the weather, you get a route list of 200 papers that you have to deliver, and you could be driving hundreds of miles because, it could be 20 miles in between.
It's not like Portland and South Portland.
Well, even in South Portland, you can drive 2 blocks before you're throwing another newspaper.
Yeah.
And so as the circulation has contracted, it makes the job of delivering harder and then frankly more expensive, because in order to keep people in those cars, driving their own cars to deliver newspapers on our behalf, you have to pay them. Gas prices don't help. There are so many factors that go into, I feel like, at least before I got to the newspaper, it always seemed like this magical thing, right? Like
The paper
every
was out
day,
on the
that's right, every
front porch.
day, here's the news in print on my doorstep. And the reality of the workflow that is behind that is, it's remarkable. I mean, it is remarkable, and it's expensive.
See, the world has changed.
So
I was
much.
12 years old, 13 years old, 14 years old, getting up at 5:30 in the morning, going down to the corner where the bundle of newspapers are, putting it in my bag and going around. Of course, I delivered a newspaper to just about every house.
That's exactly right. That's the difference.
That doesn't happen.
And how many
anymore.
blocks do you think you were going?
I was in a neighborhood, so I may have had 80 newspapers in one neighborhood.
Yeah.
But also the other kid. Now, you're not going to find too many kids that get up at 5:30 in the morning to walk out in the cold and deliver newspapers. In my day, your parents expected those kind of things.
Yeah, I
different
mean,
day.
in order to make our guaranteed delivery time, which is just a whole other topic for another day, I mean, our carriers are picking up newspapers when the printing ends about 1 a.m. And so they're out on the streets, I'm not kidding you, for 4 or 5 hours a night. Like, it's their full-time job, delivering newspapers. And that's just one newspaper route. And so that part of our business is probably not sustainable in the places where we're especially rural, because of all of those factors.
Yeah.
I do think that a Sunday newspaper is still something people really enjoy. I could see that being around for longer than the daily newspapers.
Yeah.
You said 10 to 15 years. This business, I've been in it for over 20 years. The rate at which it's changed is so intense. I don't have any predictions for 10 to 15 years. But 5 years down the road, I think there's still a Sunday paper. I think there's still something people
Sunday
get to
paper
enjoy
in print.
all week long. Yeah, in the printed sections.
But there will still be, if you went digital, it'll still be every day a digital
Exactly.
paper.
100%.
Absolutely.
But
And
maybe,
publishing all day long, not
Yeah.
just in the morning or
Yeah.
in the evening.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, part of the resource conundrum that we have is that so much of our staff is oriented to the timeline that it takes to get all of the news, get it together, put it on the pages, get it down to the printing facility. So if we can think about the way that those resources are aligned, put more of them back into the newsroom, put more of them into actually producing the news, then we can do more news. And that is our objective. Our objective is
So more
to
money, if you make certain changes over the next several years, more money can go into news gathering and
100%.
reporting.
100%.
And then you distribute it in all the ways that a digital reader likes to read it, right? Whether that's in a newsletter or an e-newspaper or the website.
Or an app or podcasts or
Exactly.
all of those places where people are finding their
Does that
news.
include, I don't know if that's what you meant by e-newspaper, but does that include, I can see this morning's Press Herald online, and it's the paper, it's what
That's
it
right,
looks like.
Yes,
Yep.
that's the e-newspaper.
That's an e-newspaper.
Yes.
All with a layout,
That's
like a
right.
newspaper.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah. So it seems to me that there's a possibility that that's where it's all going. Do you think there would, this is not a local journalism question, but do you think that the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Boston Globe, others will still have print newspapers someday?
Again, if we knew the magic answers to the questions, we wouldn't be sitting right here in Maine trying to figure it out.
Right.
I think the reality of, I know from our own experience here in Maine, we deliver the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times here. So if we take our delivery system and make changes to it, it affects those newspapers.
Right.
They don't have delivery resources
Right.
across the country.
No.
They rely on infrastructure like ours.
And they can't even rely on the mail, because the mail only comes 3 times a week.
And
now.
I will also tell you that part of our business, which we've called alternate product revenue, has also been declining because their print circulation is declining. And so, it's this.
The Wall Street Journal and the New York Times?
Yeah, less and less people want it in print because they can
Read
open
it
their
on their
computer or their phone and have it right there in at their fingertips.
Interesting.
So,
But the
so
digital customers are increasing. in numbers.
absolutely. I mean, that's where this industry's going.
Yeah, see, for guys my age, this is tough for guys my age, but not for 25-year-olds.
No, but it's even more really what you want is like the 45-year-olds, right? That's who you want reading the newspaper that may not be right now because they have kids in school and they may or may not be getting involved in their community town councils. And that's the kind of, the folks that I hope that we can start reaching that we aren't reaching now. With the hope that they'll teach their kids to read the news, and then we'll get them when they get to the point where it really impacts them day to day. I also think that the e-newspaper product, what you were describing, that looks like a newspaper, is an essential bridge product. I mean, that's how I think of it. It's bridging for folks like you and others who love that print layout. It's a way for us to keep that coming to you. Even if there's days like Monday where we don't print a printed newspaper, we still did the news. We still laid it out in a way that you all enjoy. It's just on your tablet or on your phone or on your computer at work.
So this model of digital, you noted, would allow a newspaper to constantly update during the day. You wouldn't be tied to the requirements of a printing press and the time that it has. The newspaper has to be laid out and put through the press. You could be updating stories all day long, right?
I mean, we do that now to some extent.
Yeah.
Especially on breaking news.
Right. I mean, we do that to some extent, but getting out of this mindset of tonight's deadline is X and the deadline's really driven because of the printing requirements, I think would really change kind of the way that Carolyn's team goes at the news, because they wouldn't have that as a finish line, if you will.
I think the other thing is this idea of filling the newspaper, right? Every day we have to have a certain amount in order to fill the newspaper, and I think sometimes that means we make different story choices than we would if we didn't have that weighing on us. a very good sports copy editor I knew in Florida called it the daily miracle that we get the newspaper out every day. And some days that is, especially times like holidays where you have staff off, but I do think that.
You mean filling the space?
Exactly, filling the space.
Or as they say, avoiding white space.
Right.
Yeah. So I think, especially as circulation, ad revenue in print has gone down, you have more space. And I think that one of the things we can do if we aren't beholden to that space is pick stories that are, incredibly impactful or important, or things that entertain people or that they want to read, and not worry as much about filling the space.
So, as you look ahead now, how long you been here? You came up from Tampa when?
3 months.
3 months. So you now kind of looked around, you've gotten to know Maine a little bit. So ideas are coming into your head a lot about, what's needed, what you can do. Let's go back to the investigatory reporting, and because people do like to have the layers peeled away. Oh, that's what's going on at the South Portland City Hall. Whoa. How are you going to do that?
Well, I think it's two parts for us that we're thinking about. One is that in the next couple of weeks, we're going to announce the 3 people that will make up something we're calling a quick strike team, which will be an accountability team made up of very strong reporters and writers who will be doing work around whatever the biggest stories in Maine are, whether they're breaking news stories that we're jumping on or stories around subjects that people really care about. And I think, we're modeling it after something both the Miami Herald and Boston Globe do, where they have this team that moves in quickly to work with other reporters on whatever is happening around the state that's really impactful.
Is that the Globe Spotlight team? Or?
So the Globe has a quick strike team and they have a Spotlight team. The Spotlight team is their more longer term investigations where they're really digging in on one big story. And we're hoping that we'll be able to, I have a personal goal up to, raise enough money to support a team like that by the end of this year. I think that that work is incredibly expensive. You need a very strong investigative editor in order to run a team like that, because that work is incredibly hard and puts the newspaper in a perilous position if you get something wrong. So that's something I think we'll work toward, but we'll start with this quick strike team led by Eric Russell, who, as you know, is a fantastic reporter and has done work in the state for a very long time. And we're excited to get that rolling as a starting place.
So, I'm not sure I understand the difference between quick strike and spotlight. I know spotlight's longer term, takes longer, but that's more digging through things and finding things that are not obvious.
Yeah.
And the quick strike is you're working on some story, the reporters are working on some story, and the quick strike team moves over and says, we're going to help you?
Yeah, in some respects. I think some examples would be, if a big story breaks and there's going to be some accountability around it. So, how did the police respond? How did the local government officials respond? You start immediately filing records requests to find out how they responded. An example would be the Lisbon hazing incident that happened at the high school with the football team. That was a story that I think we wish we had a quick strike team for to move in and help Haley Jones, who was a young, bright sports reporter trying to handle that story on her own when no one would talk to her. That's a story Eric and Haley ended up doing toward the end of the year when he got through the election coverage. But I think if we had a quick strike team, we would have had Eric working with her right away on that to get more information and in-depth coverage about what was really happening at Lisbon and what the ramifications of an incident like that, an investigation like that were. That's one example. Another one is the Brunswick foam spill, which in some respects we did do something like this by having our Times Record team work with Penny Overton, who is our environment reporter at the Press Herald, to do coverage. But I think it wasn't formalized in a way that it will make a lot more sense now, where you sort of you get in there quickly, before anyone's paying enough attention, and maybe get some information and sourcing right away on a big event like that that has huge ramifications, and start, pounding out stories about it from an accountability perspective.
I think one of the things that that we haven't mentioned is that since Carolyn's arrival in the fall, we are now looking at our news operation as one. Previously, we had newsrooms across the state led by different editors. And it wasn't until Carolyn got here that all of news across the Maine Trust, no matter which community, all rolls up into one.
It's all Maine news.
It's all Maine news. And that is already making a remarkable difference, because we have, there are some newspapers that are better sourced than others, resourced than others.
Yeah.
And this way we're able to spread out the professional journalism across newspapers where we hadn't done that. In fact, in part of our work previously to continue to throw a profit, we were just cutting. We were cutting in places that we thought we could afford to cut. And this is just a complete shift in mindset, where we can take all of these resources, apply them across all of the newspapers, to raise the products, to do better work across the state, and take what we're learning and make sure that it's relevant to each of the communities that we're serving.
I noticed that in the Portland newspaper, that the bylines say Kennebec Journal, Morning Sentinel, Lewiston
Yeah,
paper.
just because a story is coming out of Central Maine doesn't make it irrelevant to Portland.
Right.
And so, or Lewiston, right? Like that. So, and even the weeklies. Like we, one of the things I'm proudest of this year, if I haven't said it already, is that we have, we've reinvested in our community weeklies by hiring community reporters. So we have this team of community reporters that are in the towns where our weekly newspapers are, and they are doing phenomenal work, publishing weekly newsletters and really kind of creating headlines out of those communities every week. And we weren't doing that a year and a half ago.
So you publish for town newsletters?
For some of our weeklies, we've created newsletters around that town, and we plan to do it for almost everyone. We
What's
haven't
in
gotten
the
to
newsletter?
everyone. So a newsletter is like an email you get with either links or text in it from the reporters that either has a summary of the story with the story link to it, or perhaps some of them are more curated, where you're hearing from the reporter themselves about what they've been reporting on that week, some events around town, tips from them, etc. So it comes to your email inbox oftentimes in the morning and is focused around either a topic like food or politics, or a place like Skowhegan or Hallowell, or I'm sort of naming ones we already have
Scarborough.
launched. Scarborough, there's a South Portland, Cape Elizabeth version, etc.
Now, you compete there with, I live in Cape Elizabeth.
Cape Courier.
You compete, Cape Courier, and then there's some SOPO thing I get on the, on my iPhone about news in that area. And then you have the other, there's about 5 different organizations covering Cape Elizabeth, for instance. Where do you get, well, you have somebody in Cape Elizabeth that's
Yep.
giving you the news?
Drew Johnson, yep. He covers Cape Elizabeth and South Portland.
And Scarborough.
Yeah, and Scarborough.
And how does that person report? How does he get stories? How does he know what's going on?
I mean, I think Drew, as an example, is showing up to school board meetings and city council meetings and talking to local businesses and doing it just the way anyone who would cover like a local area would cover it.
So, so you're competing. You're competing with some community newspapers, but is there synergy there?
I think there could be. I mean, the Cape Courier, which beloved in our town, is one of our commercial print customers. So again, important to our business that they keep doing what the fine work that they do. And Drew is not in Cape Elizabeth doing those stories, but instead is kind of taking a wider view of that geography that the Portland Press Herald also covers to make sure that all of the stories are being told. He's really just mining for news.
All of the stories are being told, and I think that perhaps, I'm just speculating, the Cape Courier, which is a nonprofit volunteer newspaper effort, they have to be careful about, I think, about annoying people in power, whether they're on the school board or the town council. They have to be very careful about that. So there's not going to be any tough edge or cutting edge to the stories they write.
That's right.
But there should be to yours, because you're trying to peel back the bark a little bit.
That's right.
Say, here's what's happening. So that is a big
difference.
A big difference. What about, I know that Maine Monitor, I know you don't pay for Maine Monitor stories, and I see Maine Monitor byline. And I know they're in the
They're doing a raise too.
money-raising business to get resources to do what they do. Now, that's supposed to be investigatory reporting, and do both of you have to have investigatory teams?
I mean, I do think that I come from the thinking of the more local journalism, the better. And there's enough to go around, even in the investigative space, you know.
That's a good point.
The Bangor Daily News has an investigative team that's great too. And I think even if we were to add our own, having 3 investigative teams in Maine is not a bad thing. That's a great thing, you know. And we're very lucky that the Maine Monitor shares their stories with us, and it's great for them because that means that their work reaches more people when it's on our website, right? So, or in our newspapers. So I do think that, you know, there is this idea that we all have to compete with each other for the dollars. I think there's enough dollars to go around to sustain all of us if we make people realize why we matter. And, you know, there was a time there was a lot more media local media across the country, right? And so we shouldn't root for others to fail. We should root for as many of us as possible to thrive.
So I've had an opportunity to meet a couple of young reporters for the Maine Monitor. Some are sponsored by nonprofits who are interested in developing journalists, and they're pretty impressive.
Yeah, I bet.
They're quite impressive, but they do have the time to spend on complicated stories.
Yeah, and you know, we're lucky. I think one of those organizations is going to sponsor someone for us starting in June. And I think there'll be more information about that coming out soon. But I think having a mix of people that are grinding and doing the daily news, and a mix of people that are sort of peeling back the curtain as much as possible, or writing about things that bring emotion to people or shed light on something, I think is a great mix. And I think it's great that the Maine Monitor exists and that we get to share their coverage and that they have great journalists there.
You know, I think about time, resources to dig in and do stories. I pledged to myself that I wasn't going to be on this program advising you about anything and trying to be an editor, which was a secret objective of mine. But you know, I'd like you to talk a little bit about this. Over the last few years, you've read a lot about homelessness in Greater Portland, and I've seen homelessness, and I know about political debates about homelessness, and I know a little bit about homelessness, but I don't read any in depth. I often thought I'd want to go around to street corners where I see people asking for money and actually find a way to relax them and just say, look, I'm trying to find out about this, even if I was a reporter. And how did you get here? And most people anecdotally think, well, the two major drivers are mental health and addiction, which I think is probably true. I mean, I've read quite a bit about it. But do they make much money on the street corner when they? I think
I mean,
people
I
would
wouldn't
be
know the
interested
answer
in
to
knowing
that. I think that one of the things we aren't accounting for is the cost of living. I mean, I think the cost of living in Maine has risen tremendously. It's risen across the country.
But you have no evidence. I've not read in your newspaper, now I'll be confrontational. I have not read in your newspaper any evidence that it's the cost of living that's driving the people out to the street corner in Deering Oaks to ask for money.
I mean, I think it's hard to make it, it's a fuzzy connection, right? But we know housing is more expensive. We know we need more of it, right? And we know that people can't afford rent the way that they used to be able to.
Yeah, but
And so I think it's hard to say, you know, there is people who are homeless on the corner, but there's also people that are homeless in shelters. I mean, it's a big bucket, right? There are people living in their cars.
I know, you know what the best evidence, I'm sorry to interrupt you. The best evidence is them. Ask them.
Well, and I think we do talk to homeless people, and I think we do talk to people that are living in their cars. One of our photographers did a great series over the last few years about a couple where the husband was dealing with cancer. And
I
Yeah.
read the piece. I
Yeah.
read the piece, and they were in the
Kennebunk
Maine
rest stop,
Turnpike and
yeah.
the Kennebunk rest stop.
Right.
But I'm a lawyer.
Right.
So evidence and the evidence and the most and the best evidence are the people themselves. And if I went down to Deering Oaks and they'd say, "How did you get here? How much money do you make?" Well, I wouldn't ask them how much money they get right off.
Right.
I'd
Yeah.
have to. They'd have to get to trust me a little bit.
I was going to say
to reveal that.
That takes time, that kind
Takes
of
time.
reporting, because you do have to earn their trust. I think our City Hall reporter, Grace, has done a great job trying to do some of that. And but she's covering Portland City Hall, right? So she's got to cover a lot more than that subject in order to, and she's got to cover all the different sides of the subject, which include people that are frustrated that there are homeless in their neighborhood. So I think that's a resource issue as much as anything, because I don't think it's even ethical to just walk up to someone on a street corner and start asking those questions and expect that they're just going to give us those answers.
But if you're a journalist, sometimes that's how you get.
So
you
before
get information.
Carolyn's time, we did a pretty wide, in-depth, long-term investigation on homeless in Maine, and I wonder if maybe doing some sort of catch up from that, because I think it was right after the pandemic. I don't know. Don't quote me on the timing, but we did a very comprehensive look at homelessness in Maine and profiled a whole bunch of different people in
Okay.
different circumstances.
And that's what I mean,
Yeah.
I think people are interested in
Yeah.
that. Now, we read a lot about, we only got 5 minutes left, so I'm going to throw out a couple of these. But we read a lot about the housing crisis. Of course, there have always been housing crises. After World War II, it was a terrible housing crisis. So building housing costs money. Its construction costs are up. So either the government can build it or private enterprise can build it. Well, there's only two sources for housing. The government builds, they used to do this in all the communist countries very poorly. Big, square, unattractive housing. So either the government builds it or, and both the government and entrepreneurs have the same problem, money. And so we never see a story about underneath what's causing this. Where's the failure? Why aren't we building housing?
I mean, I think we did, and again, this was before I got here, but we did do a series on housing that we continue to work on around what the holdup is, honestly. I mean, I think some of it is that there are areas that are making it hard for people that are willing to finance housing with permitting and other issues.
True.
There's
And you did do a story about that. I agree.
And I think that there's also stories about innovative ways that people are coming up with solutions to housing. The tiny homes, the mobile homes, the other types of materials people are using to create housing that they can put up quickly instead of taking this long extended process. So I think housing is just going to be an issue we're going to continue to hit from different angles, because it is clearly, even just seeing it from like an audience perspective, it's of a high interest.
I will just say, going back to these topics of interest, part of our work is about finding out what people want. What do people want to read about? What are they willing to pay for to read about? And then applying our resources to do that. And part of the benefit of us being owned by a national nonprofit is that we can we can decide that we're going to cover X, Y, or Z, and go out and find the people who are willing to fund that work, which is lots of man hours and
So is that a part of actually part of the model? That is, okay, if we want to really dig into something and it takes a lot of money, a lot of resources, you got to put 2 people for 200 hours of work to go out and find somebody who will fund it.
Yep. I mean, Carolyn's been here for 3 months. She's done a remarkable job of kind of realigning our existing news resources. We have a little bit more of that kind of work to do. And then you heard she's got a personal goal of funding all sorts of different coverage by the end of the year, and that's where we want to go. We want to go to the place where we understand what Maine wants to know about their state and put our resources against covering it so that our business can thrive.
I want to say to the audience, if any of you have some resources that you want to invest in this, or know people who do, call these 2 people and let's peel away the layers, help them peel away the layers. And as I said, sunshine is the best disinfectant. Thank you both.
Thank you,
Thank
Harold.
you,
coming
Harold.
here. I appreciate it very much. It was very interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So now, they can't hear us. and we can chat. Very, very interesting.
It was great.